The health and safety rating system has changed, but enforcement is the real story. The danger that most landlords see within the headline are they've simplified HHSRS. But the real headline for me is they've simplified it so that more officers can use it. And they're hiring more officers to enforce it. So, why do landlords need to know? So, pay attention. Today, I want to talk to you about the changes in the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, or HHSRS. Now, I can almost hear some of you say, what on earth is HHSRS? And that's actually part of the problem. For years, HHSRS has been one of the most misunderstood pieces of legislation in the private rented sector. It was actually introduced under the Housing Act 2004 and was designed to help local authorities assess whether a property presented a risk to the health and safety of the people living there. The challenge was that the system was incredibly complicated, and they made it incredibly complicated over the years. There were 29 separate hazard categories, and inspectors had to assess the likelihoods, the outcomes, the severity, scoring bands, and harm classes. And many landlords struggled to understand it. I know I did. And if I were being honest, many officers that I spoke to found it difficult to apply consistently as well. As a result, enforcement often was dependent on the individual officer carrying out the inspection. That has now changed. The government has reviewed the system and introduced a simpler framework. Surprise, they've made it simpler. The number of hazard categories has reduced from 29 to 21. The old A to J scoring bands have been replaced with high, medium and low. The harm categories have been simplified, and the way hazards are scored has become easier for officers to calculate and apply. Now, on the surface, that sounds like good news, and in many ways it is. A simpler system should create greater consistency. But here's the bit that is important. The government has also committed £60 million towards enforcement activity. Councils are recruiting additional officers. Enforcement teams are growing. And many local authorities are now expected to become far more proactive than they've been in the past. For years, some landlords I've spoken to have taken a comfort from the fact that inspections were relatively rare. There's no one in the council to do it. And really, the reality was that simply councils didn't have the resources. But that environment is definitely changing. And that means landlords need to start thinking differently. The question is no longer, will the council inspect my property? The question for me is, if they do, what will they find? Now, before anyone panics, let's put it into context. Most landlords are not deliberately breaking the rules. Most landlords want to provide good homes, but many properties have slowly drifted over time. Certificates, they've expired. Repairs got delayed. Standards changed. Legislation, that's evolved. And what was acceptable, in some respects 5 years ago, may no longer be considered acceptable today. The interesting thing is that historically, around about 88% of Category 1 hazards identified in the private rented sector came from just 4 areas. The top was falls, second excess cold, third damp and mould, fourth fire. So let's break those down. Falls were the biggest category, and that includes stairs, uneven flooring, balconies, landings and windows. Something as simple as a missing handrail or poor lighting or inadequate window restrictions can increase risk significantly, particularly if there are children around. Excess cold is another obvious one. Inspectors will look at heating systems, insulation, drafts, and whether the property can be heated effectively. Now, energy costs are still high, and this is becoming increasingly important. And then third on the list, you'd think it would be first, we have damp and mould, a subject that many landlords are so familiar with. Inspectors will be looking at ventilation, heating, structural defects, and how quickly issues are addressed. And finally, fire safety. Simple as smoke alarms, escape routes, electrical safety, and the overall ability of your tenant to escape safely if a fire occurs. So, what is important is that many of these issues are relatively straightforward to identify and resolve. The problem is often that landlords don't know where to look and are not looking for them when they visit. And that's where professional advice becomes increasingly valuable. Because under the new enforcement environment, prevention will be always cheaper than enforcement. Fines start at £7,000. A small repair today is actually far less expensive than an improvement notice, a civil penalty, or a legal dispute tomorrow. So, what should landlords do now? First, review your property standards. Second, check your compliance records. Third, think about your property through the eyes of an inspector, not through your eyes. And finally, if you're unsure, ask. The cost of professional advice is usually far lower than the cost of getting it wrong. At Maxine Lester, we spend every day studying law, legislation and the changes so that our landlords don't have to. So if you'd like help understanding how these changes affect your property, why not get in touch? I'm Maxine Lester, and thank you very much for watching Maxine Lester TV. Make sure you subscribe to get more updates like these.